Hello, this is a peripheral view, and my name is Dr. Alfonso Severos. I'd like to speak a little bit about uh, the current crisis, uh, the ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine, especially as it relates to American policy. Uh, if you look at Donald Trump, he wants to pull out uh, end the support for Ukraine and allow Russia to go ahead and do what it intends to do. Uh, at this point, Harris seems to want to maintain the Biden policy of continuing funding Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. Uh, both points have some strengths and some weaknesses. Uh, Trump's idea of not supporting Ukraine has a lot to do with the idea of NATO. He thinks NATO is his biggest beef with NATO is that the NATO nations doesn't pay their fair share. He looks at it in terms of paying their fair share, not in terms of policy. So he wants to pull out or eliminate NATO without offering any workable alternative. Harris spoke of maintaining a policy, but I'm kind of hopeful that she will put her own bend, her own flavor, her own twist to the American policy with Ukraine and Gaza when she's in office. It's kind of difficult for her to come out and look at something, an alternative, while she's still vice president that is different from the policy of the current president. But know that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is not a conflict of communism, because neither are communist countries. Russia is a capitalist country. It may be more like a dictatorship, but its economy is a capitalist country. So was Ukraine, or so is Ukraine, what's left of it. But this conflict is old. It goes back, a little over 1,000 years that these two entities, Russia and Ukraine, had disagreements. Both contribute the founding of their nation and the founding of the Orthodox religion to Kiev in the 13th century. In fact, Kiev, Kiev, was the capital of Russia before they moved it to Moscow. And so there was an ongoing conflict. I live in a community that consists of both a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, the Brighton Beach section of Brooklyn. And to be quite honest, I can't tell the difference between the two. Ethnically, they seem very similar. Many Ukrainians speak Russian. In fact, half the nation, the half bordering Russia, is pro-Russia. The other half is pro-independence. That's important to remember. But let me give you a little history. If we go back to starting in 1918, Ukraine declared its independence. It became a sort of independent nation from Russia. But that independence only lasted 3 years. And this is 1918, excuse me, not 1818. And then 3 years later, in 1921, Russia overthrew an independent Ukraine, and it became part of the of Russia. If we skip ahead a number of years, between 1939, and 1944, the years in which Nazi Germany occupied Ukraine and part of Russia. And don't forget, we would never have won World War II if it wasn't for the Russian army, because that occupied and defeated significant forces of the Nazi army. Hitler made the same mistake Napoleon did, trying to fight on two fronts. And it was very close that Russia could have allied itself with the Germans. And if they would have done that, the outcome of World War II would have been much different. But it wasn't. And Russia suffered terrible losses in World War II. And we couldn't win that war without them. Now, here's the thing. During those years, 1939, 1934, the half of Russia that's close to Russia identified with Russia and the Allies. The other half wanted to go with Germany and identified with the Nazis because they hated Russia more than they did Germany and the Nazis. And even though they were rounding up Jews in Ukraine, and we know what they were doing to those folks. So there's deep-rooted problems and ethnic conflicts within that country of Ukraine. So after the war, Ukraine was still part of Russia. 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine was given its independence. The Soviet Union dissolved itself, and Russia shrunk. Part of the strategy of Putin is somehow to regain that old Soviet Union. I doubt if he's able to do that. So, 1991, Ukraine declared independence, becomes an independent state, and there's still this division within the country of Ukraine with a strong pro-Western Russian element and a strong pro-independent element. 1913, that division erupts into 2013 into armed conflict between the pro-Russian and the anti-Russian group. That armed conflict really explodes in 2014 when the current head of Ukraine, or newly elected head of Ukraine, adapted a pro-Russian policy. And half the country, a good portion of the country, broke out in disturbances and riots. And they eventually were able to replace him, and he had to flee. He fled the country, and he was replaced with a president that was pro-independence. Some say the U.S. had played a major role in supporting that pro-independence, anti-Russian movement against the president and his removal. But that's neither here nor there. 2014, that conflict became violent between the pro-Russian end of Ukraine versus the independent group. Some of it had to do with NATO. So the U.S. and other NATO countries began arming one group, especially after Russia invaded, in support of the pro-Russian group. And we have this conflict that started between Eastern and Western Ukraine that developed between Ukraine and Russia. And that's where we are today, this ongoing conflict that has its origin in a 1,000-year conflict that has a strong ethnic conflict element. We've gotten ourselves involved in this. And I live in the Brighton Beach area, which has a significant number of Russian Americans, and Ukrainian Americans. And to be God's honest truth, I really can't tell the difference between the two. That doesn't make a difference. That doesn't mean too much. But they seem less concerned about that conflict and more concerned about their survival and social mobility here in the United States. So this is a ongoing situation that's draining the American economy. We're putting billions and billions of dollars supporting Ukraine in a fight that they will not necessarily win at least in terms of defeating Russia. They may win some battles and gain some ground, but they're not going to defeat the Soviet Russia. And Russia, in the meantime, is draining its resources in this ongoing conflict. It's their Vietnam. So they didn't learn from Afghanistan and their involvement, where they had to leave with their head between their legs. So what does the United States do? What does the next president do? Well, the next president needs to not take the position of Biden and say, I'm not talking to Putin. You know, Putin has the support of a major, huge, important country, one of the big three. You know, we can draw these lines between Russia, China, and the United States, but these are old divisions that go back between communism and capitalism that no longer exists in this world, no clear lines. And we need to look at making new strategies that incorporates the big three in decision-making to maintain the benefit of this planet and the future existence of the human race. So we got to move away from old concepts like NATO and these other kinds of pro-Russian versus anti-Russian, and making China the villain. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Unfortunately, I'm not too optimistic that this will occur in terms of developing new kinds of alliances that ensure the survival of the planet, alliances that ensure the combating of climate change and all the problems that we see, instead of drawing lines on old divisions and old wars. Just something to think about when we hear this and read about the conflict going on in Ukraine, and it has nothing to do with communism. Thanks for watching and listening, and I hope this has been helpful.